Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So we're going to try our second tips and tricks uh, Q&A. And today I want to have more Q&A, so I'm not taking as much time for tips and tricks as I did last week. Um, and remember, I think most of you are muted, so if you have a question, please remember to unmute yourself first. So I'm going to talk about XL recalculation, not specifically XL statements, at least not most of it. And then I've got an update on version 3. And then, like I said, uh, I want to leave the bulk of the time for Q&A. And if there isn't any Q&A, then this is going to be a pretty short session. So XL recalculation. So manual versus automatic. And I assume you're all aware of these modes. But it's pretty obscure exactly how they work. So my first point here is that you're setting this for the entire XL instance. So if you change from automatic to manual, you're doing that for all workbooks that you have open in your instance of XL. And recent versions of XL, for the last 10 years anyway, you're always by default opening all your workbooks in the same instance. So something really strange is when you start up Excel, it's going to use the calculation mode that was set the last time you saved a workbook. So think about that. That's pretty strange. So it does not save the mode you were in when you exit Excel. It saves the mode that you were in the last time you saved a workbook. And it does not save the mode along with a workbook. So if you save a workbook set while you're set to manual and you reopen that workbook, if you're now set to automatic, um, it's going to open with automatic recalculation. I'm sorry. Um, yeah, with the mode that you're in at that point. So it does not save the calculation mode with any workbook, and it does not save it when you exit Excel, but when it saves it for the next time you open is if you saved a workbook. So if you save a file and you're in manual mode and you get out of Excel, even if you switch back to automatic mode before you leave Excel, when you open Excel again, it's going to be in manual mode. So really strange behavior, and certainly from what I've seen, not many people really understand that. It's documented, but that's the kind of documentation that's hard to find as well. So an XL instance, uh, like I wrote here, for the last 10 years, well, you may remember before Office 2010, if you opened an Excel file, it was in its own instance. It was in its own environment. And you may not have noticed the difference, but the difference there, a lot of it has to do with recalculation because each instance recalculates individually. So if you recalculate an instance and you have a second instance open, that nothing happens with that second instance of Excel. And if you are always opening a whole lot of workbooks at the same time, and you find that your recalculation gets slower and slower because you're recalculating all of those when you only really want to recalculate one of them, then you could open Excel in a separate instance and then open the other workbook. Um, and you do that by going to your Excel icon and right-clicking on it. Let's see. And then I think using Shift. I don't know. You can look that up, or if someone has a question about it, I can show you how to do it. So that's one reason to open in separate instances in a more recent version of Excel. Another reason is if you're using 32-bit Excel and you find yourself running out of memory because you've got a lot of workbooks open, a separate instance uses different memory, at least in the in Office 365 in the latest versions. So that's what you need to know about, or maybe you don't need to know, but there is such a thing as an XL instance. And I know when people first got XL 2010, it can be very confusing because the behavior was different. And it's kind of, again, it's kind of obscure behavior. So your recalculation, you've actually got 3 settings, but only 2 really matter, manual and automatic. So I typically I change it to manual mode when I'm creating a new report, just so I don't have to keep waiting for it to recalculate when it's on automatic, when I'm doing something like inserting rows or something like that. So when it's in manual mode and it knows it has something that's not calculated, it's going to put a little calculate message down lower left of your status bar. And then when you calculate, you can click on that or you can press the F9 key, and that's going to calculate all uncalculated formulas on your in your workbook. And so just so you know, it flags a formula as being uncalculated, but once you've run a calculation, that formula becomes flagged as calculated. And so hitting F9 is not going to do anything because it doesn't see anything as changed and then it needs to calculate again. Okay. And you can also use Shift F9 to recalculate just the current worksheet or tab. So if you're creating a report with multiple worksheets in it and you're doing it in manual mode because you're creating it, and you just want to recalculate the sheet you're on, you can do Shift F9. And of course, you can choose these also from the formula ribbon. So automatic, and I kind of think of this as the natural mode. When I do demos, I certainly expect to be in automatic mode. And when you're using a report as opposed to designing it, you probably want to be in automatic mode. And so automatic will update any formula when any precedent value changes. So if you have a PTT-BAL formula and that's looking at a cell where you stored the company ID, when you change the company ID, any of those formulas that have that now changed precedent in them, using it as an argument in one of those formulas, that will recalculate those formulas. So XL statements functions are not what are technically called volatile, which means they're not going to recalculate on automatic mode unless a precedent cell changes. And so if your underlying Dynamics SL data changes, somebody goes and posts a batch, that's not going to cause the number to change on your workbook unless you recalculate that particular formula. So just so you're aware of that. I mean, we could have made them volatile, but then every time an automatic recalculation was done, it would go and refetch all that data from the database. And I guarantee you would not like that behavior. If every time you change something, you had to wait, I don't know, numerous seconds in order for it to finish refetching all of that data. So in XL statements, those formulas, like your balance formulas, they're going to recalculate, obviously, when you first enter them. They're going to calculate when you enter those. And using that same behavior, you can force one particular formula to recalculate. Just hit F2 and enter. Or you can select the formula and then move your cursor to the end of the formula and hit enter if you want to as well. And that will just make that one call to your data and refresh just that one cell. So formulas obviously calculate when you open a workbook as well. If you're in manual mode, then you're going to have to do an F9 or something, but they're all set to recalculate. They're marked as not being calculated if you're in manual mode, or if you're in automatic mode, they're automatically going to calculate when you open a workbook as well. Calculate for precedent value changes, I already said that. So how do you get XL statements to refetch data? So after you open a report, someone went and posted a bunch of batches. So the way that a lot of people do it is they just go and change the precedent value. So let's say your period, they'll go and change that. So you're looking at period 6, you could go change that to 5 and then back to 6, and that's going to refetch all of that data. The problem with doing that, though, is you're actually calculating everything twice. So you went back and you changed it to 5 and it recalculated everything, and then you changed it back to 6 and it recalculated everything. So you're really doubling the work that it's doing. And those of you who have relatively slow Excel statements reports or environments, that's something you don't want to do. If it's taking 10 seconds to calculate your Excel statements report, you don't really want to take 20 seconds just to go refetch. So the method I typically use is Control-Alt-Shift-F9, which is documented somewhere, but I don't think it's on any of the menus or anything like that. And that's going to recalculate all formulas in every workbook in your instance. So if you have a bunch of workbooks open, that could take a long time. And so, you might think about, well, if I'm going to need to do that, then maybe I should close the workbooks I'm not using, or maybe open what I'm working on in a separate instance. And then another way to do it is the Excel statements reset button. That will force a full recalculation, but it also does a lot of other stuff. So it's going to be slower typically to do that. So just some tips on recalculation if you find your reports are taking a while to recalculate. So my biggest tip is to use that drop-down list capability. Use that functionality in Excel statements rather than creating a separate sheet or tab for every entity that you're working with. So I've seen a lot of sites where they'll have a workbook for something like P&L variance report, and they'll create a tab, and the Excel statements report capability makes this easy if you set up a drop down. But they'll have a tab for, let's say, every department. So they may have 10 tabs in there, and then they go and change the period or in some other way force that workbook to recalculate or just open it. It's going to have to go and calculate everything on all 10 of those worksheets. And if you use a drop down of departments instead, then you go choose a different department, it's only recalculating that one particular sheet. And that's true, you could have different sheets for different reports. So you could have one worksheet or tab for your balance sheet, another one for one particular kind of P&L, and another for a third or second kind of P&L. And you can create one drop-down list and go and change that. And yeah, if all 3 sheets are pointing to that same drop-down list for the sub-account mask, it's going to recalculate all 3 of those sheets. But that's a lot better than having, I don't know, if you have 10 departments, having 30 sheets. So maybe you're waiting 6 seconds as opposed to waiting 30 or 60 seconds to recalculate all those sheets, because you can't look at more than one sheet at a time anyway. So just go and use the drop-down list to get what you wanted to look at, as opposed to going and clicking on another tab. And so just an example of that, the typical one is where you have a sheet for every department or every company or something like that. And yeah, okay. And then I already mentioned IOs, well, I typically use manual calculation mode when creating reports. I don't do that in demos just because it's nice to see the numbers all changing automatically. And so just to point out, every one of the Excel statements functions does fetch data individually from your Dynamics SL databases. So if you have 10,000 Excel statements functions on your workbook, on your worksheet, and I've seen that, and then you recalculate it, that could take a while because it's making 10,000 separate calls to SQL Server and getting the data, 10,000 different packets of data back. And just to point out, the first time you recalculate or when you open a workbook, that's going to be the slowest. So if you recalculate later, the second, third, fourth time, you'll notice that that is faster than that first time. So some other tips: don't include too much detail on a worksheet. I mean, I've seen worksheets with thousands of rows because they've got not only accounts, but a separate row for like every sub account under each account. And I'll just tell you that a report like that, that's not particularly usable. You're scrolling up and down, you just got a tremendous amount of data to try to look through. And then the other thing to remember for a report like that, you can just double click on a number and that will break out by sub accounts. That's going to show you by sub account. So you don't need all of that on your report when you can just double click and easily see that particular detail behind a number. So using optional arguments in your balance functions, like include unposted, net, the console arguments, using those is definitely going to be slower than not using those. Because, well, technically, if you use those, it's always going to have to go and look at your detailed transactions, your GLTran information. If you don't use those, it's typically going to get that information from the history table. And so that's a lot faster than going and sifting through what might be millions of rows of data. It's only looking through hundreds of rows instead. And here's something that I don't normally mention, but using masks for your argument, that's faster than using lists or ranges. So if you've got a range, like my example here, 1100 through 1199, if you just use 11 question mark, that's going to recalculate faster than that same range. It's going to get you exactly the same thing, but it's going to recalculate slower if you use a range or if you use a list. I mean, if you can use some kind of range instead of a list, then definitely, if you use some kind of mask instead of a list, then I would definitely say that's going to be faster as well. Expanding subaccounts, which is one of the options for drill down, that's definitely slow as well. That's not going to slow down your report, but it's definitely going to slow down your drill down. Your system environment also affects the performance. So the speed of your workstation where you're running Excel, that's about half of the performance of XLstatements is on your workstation, and then the other half is on the SQL server. And so the speed of the processor there, the number of processors that it's using in your workstation, and I don't know if you've noticed, but down on the status bar, while it's recalculating, it'll tell you the percent finished. It will also show you how many processors it's using. So if you're getting a new workstation and you do a lot of work in XLstatements and it's not as fast as you would like, you might mention to your IT people for that new workstation that you'd like a quad processor system. And rather than one running at 2 gigahertz, maybe you could get one running at 3.5. And that's definitely going to speed up XLstatements. Your LAN or network speed. So if you're using 10 megabits per second on your LAN, moving to 100, or if you're using 100, moving to 1 gigabit, that will be noticeable in XLstatements. And then I have to mention here that we always talk about LAN, and you want your workstation on the same LAN or local area network as your SQL server. And if you don't have that, if you are using RDP to get to use Dynamics SL because it's in a different location, you should be using XLstatements the same way. So your IT department will need to set up XL for you to RDP and use XL at the same location as your Dynamics SL databases. And if you're not doing that, if you're trying to use XL locally and go over some kind of wide area network or internet to get to your Dynamics SL databases, that's going to be very slow. And we basically say don't implement it that way. And then the SQL Server itself, if you update your SQL Server and get new hardware, and that's faster and has faster storage, you will notice Excel statements will get faster as well. And then using the hide 0 rows, that slows recalculation. I'm sure anyone who uses that realizes that. And one way to mitigate that is always select the smallest area for your non-zero check range. Always select as small an area as you can. I've seen people select the entire worksheet and then say, okay, make that non-zero, and that will work. But I guarantee that's going to be slower than if you had selected the necessary range. So that's all I had on recalculation. So just to give you an update on version 3, we're waiting now on something that we were supposed to have had, which is a test/demo database that we want to use for our internal or alpha testing. So we're still waiting for that, and we're hoping we'll get that this week. But we haven't been just sitting on our hands. We have made a couple changes in the last week, actually. So for JTDBal, for the project balances, we're no longer making company ID even a parameter for that. So we have an optional parameter that won't filter by company, but you're just telling Excel statements what database to use by giving it a company ID. And you don't need to use that even if you have multiple companies or even multiple databases, unless you're using the same project ID across more than one database. If you have multiple project companies in the same database, you cannot use the same project ID in more than one of those companies. And so this just bypasses all of that. And so that's kind of neat now. JTDBal, the only thing it requires now, and of course you can use master or whatever for these, is your account category, your project, and your task. So we're no longer asking for a company ID at all. And if you want to filter by company ID, you can do that by using the filtering capability, the new filtering capability that's in version 3. Another thing that we added that actually I'm working on right now is we're now going to make it Excel statements, I'm not going to say easily, but we're going to allow your consultant to include tables that you may be using with Dynamics SL that aren't part of the core product. So that may be from an ISV product that you bought, e-banking or something like that, or it may be because your consultant has used a developer or been the developer to customize your system and add tables that are necessary to your business. And in particular, if those were added for reporting, now we'll let that consultant then add those tables into Excel statements so you can now filter on those in version 3 and that you can include columns in your drill down from those tables as well. So that's stuff we've been working on like in the last week. That's new that we hadn't done before. So Q&A, or if you want me to show you a little bit about calculation, let me go into Excel. And this, whoops, wrong one. I opened a database. This is a 32 gigabyte database. So it's a pretty big database. So I'm not using the demo data, which is what I usually use in demo. That's pretty small, and if you've seen a demo, you know it's only got data for a couple periods in it as well. So this one, we use this one for testing where we've only really got one sub account. So we'll just choose that because we have to test with lots of different modes. And like I said, this is also a huge database. So this has millions and millions of rows in it. And so there's a chart of accounts. And I'm just going to double click here. And when you double click on that, it increases your column width to match the widest value in that column. And then I'm just going to, because I want to get something that's going to take a while to recalculate, I'm just going to use the fill handle to fill across for my periods here. And to get it to do this, I'm holding the control key down. If I don't hold the control key down, it's just going to copy ones across here. On the other hand, I could do this. I could do 1, 2, right? and then I could select those two, and now I'm not holding the control key down, and it can figure out what I'm doing from that. But by holding the control key down, I don't have to do that. And by the way, I just erased that. If you move the fill handle over the cell, it'll erase what's in the cell as well. So if I got something in there, I can erase it easily by just dragging the fill handle over it and erase it that way. It's like hitting the delete key while you're in it. So we're going to do, let's put a fiscal year in here anyway. (2014). Oops. Okay, and so equals PTD bell, Control Shift A, go get my account from here, F4, 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 to make it the absolute column and relative row. And I'm going to do the same thing for my period. F4, F4 for relative column and absolute row. And then I'll just copy this across. And then I'll double click on the fill handle. And you can see it calculating down here. 8 threads, took about 2 seconds. And it'll tell you the percentage complete for each second. So if this took 10 seconds to recalculate, it would say 8 threads, 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%. Now, unfortunately, or I don't know, fortunately, I have a new laptop, and this thing is incredibly fast. So even though it's recalculating about 4,000 formulas here, it's so fast that it's taking less than 2 seconds. So you kind of have to watch carefully down there. Let's go and freeze my panes here. And let's shift and right and down to select that same range again. And then I'm just going to go ahead and change. Okay. All right, so I'm seeing all my accounts for 12 periods of the year. And so if I go in here and I'm going to change my year to 2013, now watch down here, right down here, lower right of the status bar. And I'm going to hit enter. Oh, so I don't know if you saw that or not, but again, it took less than 2 seconds to recalculate this. Kind of wish I had my old laptop back because that probably would have taken more like 3 seconds. So that's, again, certainly one way to recalculate. If you want to recalculate and fetch the latest information from Dynamics SL in here, or again, I can do Control Alt Shift F9. And I don't know if you're watching down there. Boom, boom. Okay, so it took about 3 seconds. Are you able to see that or not down here? You guys are on mute, so if somebody wants to answer, turn the mute off. Let me do it again and watch down here while I do that. Control Alt Shift F9, 23, 47, 71, 100. Okay, so that actually took 4 seconds. And one reason it takes longer is it's also going and recalculating all of these. And if I change a precedent cell precedent cell for just my PTD vowels, it's only going to recalculate the PTD vowels. So it's not going and updating these as well. So that's something else you need to know. If someone's going in and editing your chart of accounts to change some account names or something like that, these are only going to change if you force a recalculation of the entire workbook. So you need to do that Control Alt Shift F9. Changing this to 2014 and back to 2013 is not going to change these because it's not using that. If you change the company ID, then it's going to change all of these. It's going to have to recalculate all of these as well as all the PTD values because they're also pointing to that. Okay, and you've got this little area over here on the formulas ribbon, and so this is where you can set automatic or manual. And hitting this is just like hitting F9, which is what it's showing you. And this is like using Shift F9 to just do the sheet. And if you are using manual, and we'll go make a change here. Okay, so nothing happened. We didn't wait for anything. But you notice down here, it says calculate. That means it's got pending calculations. And so I could hit F9, I could hit Shift F9, or I can click on calculate, and you'll see it working over here again. Okay. And again, with it on manual, if I save this workbook and then I exited Excel and I go back into Excel, Excel is in, or if I just open another workbook that causes Excel to open. I don't have Excel open, but I double click on an XLSM or XLSA file. It's going to open Excel. And again, it's not looking at anything about that workbook, but it's basically looking at the setting the last time Excel saved a workbook. So it's strange behavior, but it's something that a lot of people don't understand because it is so strange. So if that's not clear, let me know and I'll try explaining it again. But so that's what I had to talk about on recalculation. So do we have any questions about this or anything else?
I got a couple questions, Jonathan. This is Dave. On the recalculation, if you're using this functionality on a terminal server where multiple people have access to the same workbooks, is that workbook recalculation function saved from the last user on the workbook, or is it per user per workbook?
It's not based on workbook. Well, it's based on workbook only in that the last workbook you saved, whatever mode it was in the last workbook you saved. If you have,
right.
So if you're talking about remote users RDPing in to use Excel, that's going to be,
yes.
That's going to be, they're each starting a separate instance of Excel. It's under their profile or their virtual piece of that machine. And so they don't affect each other at all. They're not using the same instance of Excel. They may be loading from the same Excel.exe file, but it's a separate instance. And so that's always going to be separate instances for those users, just like you can open Excel as a separate instance as well. So let's see if I can remember how to do this. So I'll go down here, I'll right click, and then if I held Shift down, okay, so this is now a separate instance of Excel. And so if I recalculate in here, it's not going to affect my other instance of Excel. So, and again, I know a lot of people who've been using Excel for decades, and that used to be the way it worked. And it was baffling to some people when the behavior changed when Office 2010 came out. So what do they call it? They call it the MDI interface as opposed to the SDI interface. I mean, that's what the programmers at Microsoft called it. I think it was a good idea to have everything open and all the workbooks open in the same instance by default, but it does cause some things like if you use that Control-Alt-Shift F9 and you've got 17 workbooks open, you're going to be waiting a long time because it's forcing recalculation of every single formula in every single workbook that you have open. Okay, yes, you had other questions.
I do have one other question, and this is based on my own stupidity. But I was showing Excel statements to a potential customer, and I showed them, okay, I went in, I said, and you can also go here and enable security and set security up based on, sub accounts or a portion of the sub account, et cetera, et cetera. And then I simply closed Excel. So now every time I open Excel, I'm getting a message that XL statement security is enabled and you have not been given any rights. The XL statements add-in will be unloaded.
Okay.
No permissions granted. So how do I get around that?
Okay, that's interesting. So you went in and you said this, and then you like deleted the row for yourself. It's automatic.
Yeah, then I just closed it.
Well, you can't get to this point unless you're an Excel statements admin, which we went over last week. Who's an Excel statements
right.
admin? You can't even open this. And the first time you open this as an admin, it's going to make a row for you, and it's going to put asterisks across here. So it's going to give you all rights. If you went in and, I don't know, delete the company ID in here and then click update, that means that you're not going to be able to use Excel statements, and you're going to get that message and it's going to close. So the way to get around that, if you can log in as another Excel statements admin, go in here and put yourself back in. That's certainly one way to do it. So I'm now, let's say I'm in as Excel statements Jonathan as opposed to Excel admin. That's back when I had my other laptop and I had a couple domains. I could go and say, oh yeah, I want to give full rights back to that person, and you have to click update for that to happen, or you can just go in and disable compartmental security again, particularly if you're using it for demos. And it's funny, we used to have it up until I think it was like 2.5.10 and see what happens when you've only got one company. All of these become disabled. So another reason why we test on a database that has only one company and one sub account is for things like that. But again, if you can get in, just go ahead and disable it as well. But again, you're going to have to be able to log in as somebody with the rights to do that, somebody different from yourself. And you as a consultant, I could also tell you how to change that. The Excel dollar options table in the system database, that has a row for each user, and that's how it tracks the named users of Excel statements as well. So if you go in there and in your row, no, wait, that's not where it is. There's another one called Excel $ CompSec Preds. If you go in there, you can go and delete the rows as well. But send me an email or give me a call if you're not able to do it the easy way where you can log in as somebody else who's an Excel statements admin, and I can certainly walk you through that.
Okay. Yeah, I can't get around it because I'm the only person that has, this is my machine, and I loaded it on my machine, and I'm the only person that uses it. So there is no other person.
Okay. Well,
I'll send you an email.
Yeah, now that I think about it, probably the easiest way. Oh no, this wouldn't work.
I mean, it won't let me. It won't let me re-add the Excel statement add-in.
Yeah, it won't because it goes and checks and says, "Oh, you don't have any rights to any companies." And we actually had a client get into a situation there. Actually, it wasn't compartmental security; it was modular security. They added some new users, and they had modular security turned on. And I'm not sure why they had it on. In fact, they couldn't tell me why they had it on. But the new users they added didn't have rights to the GL, what is it, GL trial balance? This report right here. If you don't have view rights to that report and you have modular security turned on, you will not be able to use that company. And so, they didn't realize that the Excel statements users weren't actual Dynamics SL users. And again, I don't know why they had modular security turned on, and neither did they, but it gave them the same kind of message that you got because they didn't have rights for any company to view trial balance. And so modular security will check the same thing and basically say, you may be an XLstatements user technically, but you don't have rights to view any of these companies, either through modular or compartmental security. And now that you mentioned that particular circumstance, maybe I will suggest that we give you a workaround for that, that we create a workaround in case that happened to you. I was starting to say, in earlier versions of version 2.5, if you were an admin, it bypassed all compartmental security always, and so that could never happen. So you could go set up filters for yourself, but they wouldn't do anything because when you use XLstatements, it would see that you're an admin and bypass all of that. And we had a consultant basically said, that's great, but if I want to test this or show it during a demo, I want to be able to do that. I want to be able to go and put a filter on myself for sub-account segment and be able to demo that or be able to test it without having to log in as someone else to do that. And so we now made that any filters you put in compartmental security apply to even admins. Although, theoretically, if you're an admin, you can go back in there and go change it, go change those filters. You'll change them back to asterisk. But in your circumstance, no, you can't even get back in to do that. So
yeah. Okay, I'll send you screenshots of what's going on.
So. Yeah, well, I understand exactly what you're seeing, and I'll send you technically how to do that from inside SQL Server, how to go and fix that.
Okay.
Okay, any other questions? Remember, you may be muted. Nope. Okay. Thanks, everybody. And maybe I'll see you next week.
Thanks.